The ocean remembers everything. Every secret whispered to its waves, every tear shed on its shores, every love it has witnessed rise and fall like the tide itself. In 1974, the waters off Monterey held more than salt and foam. They cradled a love story too dangerous for its time, too pure for the world that would try to destroy it. Margaret Whitmore was 17 when she first heard Caleb Reid play piano at the Lighthouse Cafe, his fingers dancing across keys like they were telling secrets only she could understand. She was summer moonlight in a white dress, privilege wrapped in innocence, while he was winter storm clouds and jazz that could make angels weep. Their love bloomed in stolen moments, midnight walks along the pier, his poetry scrawled on napkins, her laughter echoing off empty concert halls where he practiced alone. The world said no. Her father, Charles Whitmore, said it louder. "That boy will ruin you," he warned, but Margaret had already given Caleb her heart, sewn it into the melody he composed for her, let it drift with the fog that rolled in from the Pacific. When she discovered she carried his child, she felt not shame but wonder. Their love had created life, had proven itself stronger than the hatred that surrounded them. Caleb was driving through a storm the night he died, racing down Highway 1 with a silver locket in his pocket and marriage vows memorized like prayer. The rain made the road slick as glass, but it wasn't weather that killed him. Charles Whitmore's men waited in the darkness, their headlights blinding, their intentions clear. They left him broken on the rocks below the cliff, the locket still clutched in his fist, the ocean singing his song back to the stars. The official report would call it a tragic accident, a young man driving too fast in dangerous weather. But Margaret knew the truth her father's money had buried. When the authorities returned Caleb's few belongings, the silver locket lay among them, tarnished by rain and tragedy. Margaret knew without being told it had been meant for the child she carried, his final gift traveling from his dying hands to their daughter's tiny neck. Margaret gave birth alone in a sterile room that smelled of disinfectant and shattered dreams. They let her hold the baby for one night, one precious night, before her father's arrangements took effect. She whispered promises into her daughter's sleeping face, threaded Caleb's silver locket around the tiny neck, its inscription reading, "For my little light. Find me when you can." Ruby, she named her, for the deep red of sunset over water, for the precious thing born from pressure and pain. The baby disappeared into the system, carried away by strangers, while Margaret's heart bled silent on hospital sheets. Her father kept her under what he called rest cure. Months of isolation supposedly for her health, but really to break her spirit and ensure she couldn't search for the baby he'd stolen. By the time she emerged, pale and hollow-eyed, the adoption had been sealed in bureaucratic concrete. He burned every trace of Caleb from their lives, his letters, his music, even the jazz records Margaret had collected, like breadcrumbs leading back to love. But he couldn't burn memory. He couldn't touch the locket that matched her daughter's, hidden beneath her nightgown like a talisman against forgetting. Years passed like seasons changing underwater, slow, strange, filtered through the blue of grief. Margaret married a man her father chose, bore a son who inherited coldness like genetic code, built a fortune she didn't want from money that felt like blood. She attended charity galas and smiled for cameras, but inside she remained 17 and heartbroken, listening for Caleb's song in every piece of music that played. Ruby grew up in foster homes and group facilities, passed between families like a secret no one wanted to keep. Once, when she was 12, a foster mother tried to take the locket, claiming it was too valuable for a child like her. Ruby fought like a wildcat, scratching and screaming until they let her keep it. But the locket stayed with her, warm against her heart, and somehow, through the magic that defies explanation, she carried traces of her father's music in her blood. She hummed melodies she'd never heard, her fingers moving like they remembered piano keys, her voice carrying notes that seemed to come from somewhere beyond memory. At 21, Ruby began her search. She haunted government offices and genealogy websites, hired investigators with money she couldn't afford, followed every lead that promised to reunite her with the woman who had held her for one perfect night. She came so close in 1995, visiting the Monterey County Adoption Services with hope bright as sunrise in her eyes, leaving her contact information in a file marked Baby girl Whitmore. 3 months later, the building burned. The fire took everything, records, files, the last official trace of her origin. Ruby stood in the parking lot, watching 20 years of documentation turn to ash. The locket heavy against her chest, her search ended before it could truly begin. She cried for the mother she would never find, then dried her tears and decided to become the parent she'd never had. Ruby raised her daughter Chloe with fierce tenderness, working double shifts as a traveling nurse, filling their small apartment with music and stories about angels who lost each other but never stopped loving. She told Chloe the locket came from someone who loved you before you were born, teaching her the melody that seemed to live in their bones, making her promise to keep the silver pendant safe. When cancer took Ruby in 2015, Chloe was 22 and strong enough to inherit not just jewelry, but mission. She wore the locket like armor, working her way through community college, building a life from nothing because Ruby had taught her that love was the only inheritance that mattered. At 25, Chloe became a mother herself, holding 5-year-old Rosie the way Ruby had held her, the way Margaret had held Ruby for one sacred night decades before. Little Rosie was sunshine trapped in human form, all wild curls and chocolate-stained fingers and songs that bubbled up from her heart like natural springs. She would curl up in the restaurant's back booth, doing coloring books, her tongue poking out in concentration as she made every sky purple, because that's the color of dreams, Mama. The other servers adored her, sneaking her extra crackers and listening to her chatter about the invisible cat she'd named Moonbeam. Rosie hummed constantly, while brushing her teeth, while building block towers, while helping Chloe fold laundry. She made up songs about everything. The sock song for matching pairs, the sleepy time song for her stuffed elephant, and mysteriously a haunting melody she called the Come Home song that made Chloe's heart ache with recognition. Margaret, now 74 and wealthy beyond measure, had never stopped searching. Even after private investigators returned with empty hands and apologetic smiles, she continued her ritual. Margaret never learned about the fire that had destroyed the records in 1995. She continued her annual pilgrimages, believing somewhere, in some filing cabinet, her daughter's trail still existed, not knowing it had turned to ash 25 years before their reunion. Every year on Ruby's birthday, she visited the same waterfront restaurant in the Mission District, sitting alone with wine she never drank, torturing herself in the neighborhood where her daughter might have lived, might have loved, might have died without ever knowing her name. In 2024, 50 years after Ruby's birth, the October night when worlds collided felt electric with possibility. Though neither woman recognized the magic gathering around them like storm clouds heavy with rain. Margaret sat at table 7 as always, her matching locket hidden beneath silk, her heart rehearsing familiar ache. Chloe picked up an extra shift because Rosie needed medicine and the bills wouldn't pay themselves. Her mother's locket catching candlelight as she moved between tables like a dancer in the half-dark. When Chloe approached with the wine refill, Margaret looked up and saw silver swinging in the light. Time stopped. The universe held its breath. 50 years of separation crumbled in the space between heartbeats as Margaret's hidden locket grew warm against her chest, recognizing its twin like a tuning fork struck by fate. "Where did you get that necklace?" The words escaped Margaret's lips like prayer, like confession, like the first note of a song she'd been humming her entire life. Chloe's hand moved instinctively to cover the pendant, her voice careful and defensive. "It was my mother's." "Why?" Margaret reached beneath her blouse with trembling fingers, drawing out the matching locket she'd worn for 5 decades. When Chloe saw the twin silver hearts, she stepped backward, as if struck by lightning, understanding flooding her face like dawn breaking over ocean. "I think we need to talk." They met the next day at a coffee shop near the pier, 2 women circling each other like planets finding new orbit. Margaret told her story in fragments. The forbidden love, the tragic death, the baby girl she'd held for one impossible night. Chloe listened with the careful attention of someone who'd heard similar stories whispered by her dying mother, Ruby's voice echoing across years. "Someday that locket will bring you home." The investigation that followed became pilgrimage, 2 women tracing the ghost of Ruby through hospital records and church registries, following breadcrumbs of memory through a city that had swallowed their shared history. They found retired nurses who remembered Ruby's kindness, jazz musicians who recalled her haunting the clubs, asking about a song no one could identify, neighbors who spoke of her humming melodies that seemed to come from nowhere. At the Lighthouse Cafe, now weathered and barely surviving gentrification, the elderly owner remembered Caleb with tears in his eyes. "That boy could make the piano weep," he said, leading them to a storage room thick with dust and decades. In an old box behind where the piano used to stand, they found a cracked reel labeled in fading ink, "For M.W., find me in the light." When they played it on an ancient machine, Caleb's hands came alive again through static and hiss, the melody identical to the one Ruby had been humming her whole life. Margaret collapsed into Chloe's arms as Caleb's voice emerged from the crackling recording, young, hopeful, singing the lullaby he'd written for the daughter he would never meet. "My little light," his voice whispered through 50 years of silence, "find me when you can." The same words engraved on the locket, the same promise that had traveled through generations, now proven in his own voice. In a nursing home in Daly City, they discovered Mrs. Chen, the social worker who had processed Ruby's adoption in 1974. Nearly 90 now, her body frail as autumn leaves, her memory came in waves, clear one moment, clouded the next. But she remembered the case that had broken her heart, the teenage mother who had cried when signing the papers, the wealthy grandmother who had wept silent tears, the baby with eyes that seemed to hold starlight. "I kept a photograph," Mrs. Chen whispered, her arthritic hands shaking as she opened a shoebox of memories. "Against regulations, but some cases you can't forget." The black and white image showed Margaret at 17, holding Ruby with desperate love, both their faces caught in the terrible beauty of goodbye. Chloe studied her grandmother's young face and saw her own eyes reflected back across 50 years. Saw Ruby's gentle features, saw the unbroken chain of love that had survived fire and time and all the world's attempts to destroy it. When Margaret first met Rosie, the child tilted her head like a curious sparrow and said, "You have sad eyes like the ladies in Mama's old movies. But your locket is singing. Can you hear it too?" She climbed into Margaret's lap without fear, her small fingers tracing the silver pendant. "It's trying to talk to Mama's locket. They're probably best friends who got lost." The DNA test they eventually took was merely confirmation of what their hearts already knew. Science could prove what Silver had proclaimed, but it couldn't measure the music in their blood, the way Rosie hummed Caleb's melody without being taught, the way Margaret's fingers still moved like they remembered piano keys she'd never learned to play. They discovered Caleb's song piece by piece, reconstructing it from memory and humming, from fragments Ruby had written in journals she'd left for Chloe, from the melody that lived in their bones like DNA made audible, and from the precious recording that had waited 50 years to sing again. "Find Me in the Light" became their anthem, their prayer, their proof that love could outlive the people who created it. Margaret used her wealth not to possess, but to nurture, paying for Chloe's nursing school, creating a trust for Rosie's education, buying a house large enough for 3 generations to gather, but never demanding they fill it. She had learned that love was not about having, but about honoring, not about owning, but about offering space for others to grow. Margaret taught Rosie to play piano, watching tiny fingers stretch across keys too big for her hands. "This note sounds lonely," Rosie would say, pressing middle C. "It needs friends." She'd add harmonies by instinct, creating music that sounded like wind chimes and laughter mixed together. "Grandma Margaret," Rosie announced one afternoon, presenting a dandelion bouquet, "I picked these because they're brave flowers. They grow anywhere they want, even in cracks. Like our family, we found each other in the cracks too." She patted Margaret's cheek with sticky fingers. "Don't cry happy tears, Grandma. Save them for the sad ones." 5 years later, they performed together at the Jazz Festival in Monterey. 3 generations of women on one small stage. Margaret played piano with fingers that had finally found their purpose. Chloe sang with Ruby's voice channeled through her own, and Rosie added harmonies that seemed to come from angels. On stage, Rosie wore a white dress with silver ribbons that caught the spotlights like captured moonbeams. When she forgot a lyric, she simply made up new words. "Love is like cookies that never get empty. hugs that go on forever and ever. The audience melted, and Margaret felt her heart grow 3 sizes too large for her chest. In the final note, the audience swore they heard 2 other voices joining, Caleb's deep bass and Ruby's sweet soprano, love completing its circle at last. After their performance, Chloe carefully clasped the 2 lockets together with trembling fingers. The silver hearts finally reunited after 5 decades apart. Rosie fell asleep between Margaret and Chloe in the car, the joined lockets resting against her small chest. "Look," she murmured sleepily, "now the lockets can have sleepovers too. Just like us." Her breathing settled into the rhythm of waves against shore, and Margaret understood that some angels come disguised as granddaughters, with chocolate on their faces and songs in their hearts. The ocean remembers everything, and that night it sang back to them all the songs that had been lost, all the love that had been forbidden, all the light that had found its way home through darkness so complete it had seemed eternal. The lockets, now joined on a single chain, caught moonlight like captured stars, and the music rose to meet the place where water touches sky, where time stops mattering, where love proves itself immortal as the tide that shaped every shore it touched. Margaret closed her eyes as the applause still echoed in her memory, feeling Caleb's presence like warm wind, Ruby's laughter like silver bells, her granddaughter's hand in hers like promise made flesh. The war was over. Love had won, not through victory, but through persistence, not through force, but through the patient faith that somewhere in the dark, light was always finding its way back to light. The ocean remembers everything, and it had been waiting 50 years to sing this song of reunion, this ballad of lockets and lost children, this epic of love that refused to die even when the world demanded it should. In the final measure, as the last note dissolved into starlight, 3 generations of women held each other close and felt the truth that had sustained them through all the years of searching. Love is the only war worth losing, because surrender always leads to coming home.